Unfortunately, when you work in this intellectual area, you deal with not only daunting, but what can be very depressing problems. And one of the things that I'm sure all of us have looked at with horror and with deep frustration is the inability of the international community to deal with the violence wreaked upon civilian populations. Darfur has been at the top of the headlines. Congo has more recently been highlighted, and even in terms of numbers, more horrific situation. And it's in that context that the Institute of Peace, collaborating with the Academy of Diplomacy and the Holocaust Memorial Museum, was very pleased to facilitate a task force headed up by former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and former Secretary of Defense Bill Cohen, that was designed to look at and develop a policy response that would respond to the apparent paralysis of our government and others to respond to these situations of mass violence and genocide. And so, and by the way, almost all of the issues that we're covering today are backed up by studies that are available. I noticed there's a table over here on the far right that has the interim report of the Perry report of the task force, and there will be copies of the other publications behind these panels. But let me now invite former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and General Tony Zinni, a member of her task force, to come up here for their presentation, please. Let me just say that Madeleine Albright's collaborator, Bill Cohen, unfortunately had a conflict and couldn't be with us, but we were very, very pleased to have General Zinni with us. In 1994, I got a phone call from General Zinni, then actively in the Marines. He said, "I've got all these war fighters, but the Clinton administration is sending them off on peacekeeping missions. Would you help me retrain them?" And so we got into the business of working on training programs for our military headed in the direction of post-conflict stabilization, peace building, one of the areas of our activity that I think I'm particularly pleased with. Madeleine, please.
Thank you. This little box down. All right. Good morning, and thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here and so pleased to see so many people here. And I want to thank the Institute of Peace for sponsoring this event. I think that the U.S. Institute is a fantastic organization and I think has produced amazing reports and task force reports, and I'm very proud to have been asked to co-chair the Genocide Prevention Task Force with former Secretary of Defense Bill Cohen, and we had a terrific commission, a very interesting group of task force members, bipartisan, and I think we worked very hard with expert groups, so I'm delighted, and I'm sorry that Bill Cohen was not able to be with us because he was such an integral part of this, but I am delighted that General Zinni is able to be here, and he was a major contributor to all our discussions. I have to say personally that General Zinni is one of the finest soldier diplomats, or perhaps I should say diplomatic soldiers, our country has ever had. And it was a pleasure working with him at the time, and delighted now to have had a chance to participate with him in this task force. The central premise of our task force report is that genocide is unacceptable and that we can and should do more to prevent it. The United States does not bear this burden alone, but we have both a duty and a profound interest in helping to show the way. The report prepared by our task force highlights 4 imperatives, beginning with leadership. The United States should treat the elimination of genocide as a top foreign policy priority. This duty should be part of the daily job description of every Foreign Service officer, AID official, overseas military commander, and member of our intelligence community. One doesn't have to be a specialist to raise the alarm when a bad situation begins to spin out of control. The second imperative is funding. We propose an annual appropriation of $250 million to finance specially tailored projects in countries at risk. This is a modest fund, and it would give our diplomats a potentially pivotal tool with which to avert crises. The third imperative is preparation. When I was Secretary of State, we devoted countless hours to emergency simulation exercises and to long-range planning sessions designed to identify potential trouble spots. We asked the intelligence community to monitor places where the risk of genocide or other forms of extreme violence was high, and we engaged in conflict prevention efforts in venues across the globe. And all this was necessary, and yet even then, it was not always enough. By this time next year, President Obama may well find himself agreeing with the Red Queen's statement to Alice that it often takes all the running you can do just to stay in the same place. There are many areas around the world where the kindling of crisis exists. The sparks may be ignited in any number of ways, including a military miscalculation, an assassination, a terrorist bombing, a famine, or simply an attempt by one group to seize the land or the livestock of another. Sometimes we may see a fire starting and have a few realistic ways to stop it, but more often we can succeed if we have the will to do so. And so to this end, the more versatile we are, the more effective we will be. And this argues for a robust military matched by a much stronger and better financed civilian national security capability. Even the Bush administration has admitted that nation building is sometimes necessary, but a nation cannot be built or rebuilt by military means alone. There's a vast gap between the Marine Corps and the Peace Corps, and we need to fill that gap with agencies and people who specialize in law, governance, development, peacemaking, and the creation of lasting democratic institutions. Finally, we must fully integrate crisis prevention into our government's decision-making processes. Our leaders should let it be known that however preoccupied they might be with today's crisis, the prevention of genocide and mass atrocities will always be a vital national interest of the United States. They should make it clear to the heads of every agency that important information must be shared quickly so that the right questions are asked early and every assumption is put to the test of critical thinking. This last point is especially important because it's so easy to fall into habits of analysis that are simple, convenient, and wrong. We have a tendency to look at every situation as if it were two opposing camps, one good and the other evil. In fact, most conflicts are multidimensional, morally complex, and affected by local grievances that outsiders are slow to comprehend. Politics is often compared to a game of chess, where two players move their pieces in accord with strict rules, and they have plenty of times between their moves. I don't think it works that way. In fact, politics, for me, more closely resembles billiards or a game of pool, where one ball smacks into another, propelling it into still others, creating new patterns at every move. And for me, not often predictable, though I had a Chinese student who said it was perfectly predictable, but I have not seen it played that way. We should be careful, therefore, to question every assumption, to be alert for unintended consequences, and to keep every option open. Our goal is to prevent atrocities, which means altering the calculations of people and groups we now consider dangerous. Those changes may come about through coercion, persuasion, or a combination of the two, but they are unlikely to take place without dialogue. When done for the right purpose, talking to enemies is not appeasement, it is what effective diplomacy is all about. Preventing catastrophes in the modern world requires far more than the emotional rhetoric this issue often attracts. It demands actions, not just words, and more specifically, it requires both the vision to look ahead and the wisdom to identify a destination that others will want to share. It requires a systematic plan for early warning, the effective deployment of every foreign policy tool, and a willingness to adjust course while still being true to certain core principles. For me, those principles include a commitment to democracy and respect for the dignity and rights of every human being. Now, that may sound idealistic, but without such a commitment, there would be no unifying theme to American foreign policy, no justification for sending our troops into battle, and no real difference between our objectives and those of the powers that routinely carved up the world in generations gone by. America cannot prevent genocide or other crises abroad if we are suffering from a crisis of identity here at home. And that's why I'm looking forward so much to January 20th, to a revival of what is best about our country and to a renewal of our purpose and reputation across the globe. And so when we say never again, that we really mean it and have the actions that can make that clear. And it's now my great pleasure to turn the podium over to a fabulous general diplomat, Tony Zinni.
Thank you. I have to tell you, the first time I met Secretary Albright, I was the commanding general of the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force. We were just back from Somalia. And we were running a series of exercises and seminars on how to do missions like peacekeeping and humanitarian work and familiarize ourselves with these strange new missions that we were getting hit with. She was then the ambassador to the United Nations and graciously accepted our invitation. She came down and was magnificent at the conference and the insights she gave us. And at the end, when we had a presenter with a gift, my chief of staff came up to me and he says, "You know, sir, the only gift we give people is Marine Corps fighting knife." And he said, "What should we do?" And I said, "Well, let's give her the knife." So I gave her the Marine Corps fighting knife, our K-bar, and she took it out of the sheath. It's extremely sharp, and I get worried. She's with the lectern like this and kept stabbing it into the lectern. And it says, "Finally, somebody's given me a real gift." You know, and I thought, this is our kind of lady, you know. And just to follow up, several months later, our Commandant of the Marine Corps was having Secretary Albright as a guest for an event, and he called me and he said, "I know she was there at the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force. What kind of gift do you recommend?" I said, "Well, I gave her a knife, but I think she's outgrown it. I think an officer's sword right now would be about the best we can do." In 1991, I was a young brigadier at the European Command in Stuttgart, Germany. And we had just seen the conclusion of Operation Desert Storm and the defeat of Saddam's military. And we supported that out of European Command, obviously conducted by General Schwarzkopf in Central Command. In the aftermath of that, the Kurds attempted to rise up and were brutally put down by Saddam's military. We were hearing reports about what had happened and the fleeing of hundreds of thousands of Kurds into the hills that bordered Turkey. And our command was given an alert that we might have to react to this. Secretary Baker, Secretary of State at the time, had gone out to assess the situation and suddenly realized that this was a great humanitarian tragedy that was unfolding in those hills in the middle of winter in southeastern Turkey and northern Iraq. We were ordered immediately to do whatever we could to get on the ground to provide humanitarian assistance. And I was sent down there as the deputy commander of the operation. What we found when we got there was 500,000 Kurds in brutal conditions, 17 feet of snow in some of the passes and up in the mountains, the Turkish army trying to huddle them in makeshift camps. 10,000 Kurds had died through the brutality of the Iraqi military and through the cold and the conditions, and obviously the most vulnerable, the children, the elderly. It was a real mess, and our mission initially was to provide about 30 days of humanitarian support. we quickly realized that that mission was not enough. And we were struggling over the next months to understand how to deal with this. We had a humanitarian tragedy on our hand, man-made, and obviously there was no alternative, it looked like, to return them back home or to allow them to settle in some sort of refugee camp situation on the Turkish side. We debated and discussed how we should go about stabilizing this traumatized population. We thought for a while we would build tent camps and refugee camps. Wiser heads prevailed. The United Nations members that were with us from the Banamogata's refugee organization advised against that. And we realized we had to bring the Kurds back home. But in order to bring them back home, we had to create a security zone. And we had to monitor and enforce that security zone. I won't bore you with the details there, but we obviously struggled through over a number of months how to deal with this problem. How do we protect these people? What is the best way to ensure their security, to prevent the potential mass atrocity or even worse that would occur had our protective shield had not been provided? It was an experience that taught me a lot about doing business when faced with a situation like this. I spent 3 tours of duty in Somalia. I saw the effects, sometimes intentional or unintentional, by military and militias and others that inflict harm on people, or as a result of the instability, the warfare, that traumatized populations are put at risk. As a commander of U.S. Central Command, I remember, and we had at the time the responsibility for East Africa, we had Kenyans and others that came to us asking for our assistance to help build the capacity within their sub-regional organizations, within their military, to help them deal with these sorts of problems. The problems that were humanitarian, required peacekeeping missions, genocide, or mass atrocity prevention. And I was disappointed that we never really made the commitment to help them. When we allowed things to get to the worst set of conditions and then couldn't generate the political will to deal with it ourselves, and not the preventive measures of allowing them to be able to deal with it by providing them the capacity, the training, the equipment, and also the support necessary, the logistics, the transportation, the intelligence, the communication that would make them viable in dealing with these problems. The study group obviously looked at every area, from diplomacy to the military involvement in these sorts of problems. I was enthusiastic about joining this task force because prior to this, I had just completed membership on a task force that looked at the security implications of climate change. And one of the things that we discovered in that is should the effects of climate change reach maybe its most disastrous possible results, you could have traumatized populations that access to water, access to arable land becomes minimal, mass migrations occur, and you have all the sorts of friction points and problem areas that could lead to this sort of a problem. So to me, that study made this one a logical follow-on. Obviously, because of my position on the study group, I concentrated mostly with the task group that was looking at military side of this business. The first point, and I think the most important one, is something you'd hear in almost everything we do around here, the need to integrate the smart or soft power with the hard power of the military, that we need greater integration with our other agencies of government and international organizations and agencies in understanding these problems, in dealing with them, and obviously looking at how we could prevent them. There's obviously military actions that can be taken. You know, I mentioned that with the Kurds, we created a security zone, a safe zone, that stayed in being for over 12 years and basically allowed the Kurds to prosper and do well, as we can see now. Now, that isn't cheap. Maintaining those security zones require a commitment on our part, and they will be there as long as the threats are there. But what other actions, we asked ourselves, in the way of tactics, techniques, doctrine, military policy, could we develop to look at how we handle situations like this? And how do we know what the indicators might be as we're on the ground doing other things like humanitarian missions or peacekeeping, that underlying there may be a problem that would generate a genocidal kind of action or reaction. And where are the indicators when we're involved in the conventional military operations that should lead us to suspect we might have populations at risk? So we encourage the military and the Department of Defense to look at this as a separate kind of mission. That's not to say that there aren't military tasks we already do in other areas that aren't applicable here. But we ought to be sensitive. We ought to have the intelligence requirements, the indicators, the need to develop the specific kind of tactics, techniques, procedures, processes, again, like the security zone and other things that we could do to prevent, eliminate, or in some way mitigate when we find these effects on the ground. We have to be aware that when we are on the ground operating, the potential for this exists at any time. I just came back from 2 weeks in Iraq doing an assessment for General Odierno and Ambassador Crocker on the situation there. And it's obvious you can see the tension and the friction based on ethnic or religious differences. Easily those kinds of things can explode into the kinds of situations this task force addressed. How do you mitigate against those? It may not only be the security requirement of the military, but how do we reconcile, resolve, find ways to mediate against the issues or problems that in some cases may be longstanding and historical that can easily flare up? How do we minimize, separate, or prevent these things from rising to the surface? Maybe not intentionally, maybe not directly, but indirectly become the source of our problems. One of the areas that's closest to my heart that I think we have neglected, and I briefly mentioned in terms of my experiences in CENTCOM, is the importance of security assistance programs in building local and regional capability. I've had extensive experience working in Africa and elsewhere where these problems may be most likely to occur. And I found that many of the military organizations on the ground, the governments on the ground, want to find ways to deal with these themselves. But obviously they lack the capacity. And an investment in prevention and building capacity is a heck of a lot cheaper, a lot messier, and a lot less pressure on our political will if you can build that capacity on the ground. It's their problem. They recognize this. The Chief of Staff of the Kenyan military said, we want to take care of our own problems. What we ask you is help us with the ability. Your boots don't need to be on the ground. We're willing to put our boots on the ground. But we need the support. We need the training. We need the equipment. We need your guidance and advice. And that investment, to me, I think has been lacking in the past, and I think is a much wiser way to do business by empowering organizations like the African Union and ECOWAS and East African Community and others, rather than waiting till the disaster hits and then wringing our hands about whether military forces from the first world ought to go into a situation where they will probably contribute more to the damage and destruction in the long run and the political problems rather than resolution of those problems. It's important also for us to build international and regional partnerships in dealing with this. Obviously, the United Nations and other organizations, through our unified commands, we ought to build some kind of capability to understand and deal with these. In Central Command, we had worked hard when East Africa was part of our area of responsibility to develop a series of exercises, seminars, training events to help understand these sorts of problems, beyond just sort of the military tactics and techniques. But how do we deal with them on a political level? How do we provide the non-military solutions that may come with prevention, like mediation, like addressing economic and environmental conditions that may exacerbate the problem? I think all these issues, and you can read in the report some of the ones we've made, particularly to the military, are going to be important going forward because we haven't evolved to the point where these are no longer thinkable. We see the situation in Darfur and elsewhere and the potential for these to rise up. And I would add again, based on my experience in looking at the effects of climate change, look at the rampant instability that we have around the world or near instability, these are the kinds of problems that are going to face us. A coherent international and regional set of responses is necessary. An integrated U.S. government response and preparation and understanding of these kinds of situations is required. And the emphasis here, and I think it's the most important term in our title, is prevention. It is a heck of a lot cheaper and easier and more effective than waiting to the massive tragedies that we have to deal with once they've manifested themselves on the ground. Thank you very much.
Thank you both. We have a few more minutes before we have our break and then move to the breakout panel discussions. By the way, let me just say that I'm sure for all of us sitting here, questions are popping up, and we'd love to have interaction with our speakers. Given the very rich agenda and the very large turnout, it just isn't practical in these plenary sessions. So as was done earlier with Chet Crocker, I want to ask a question that I think may be at the heart of the issue that was discussed today. And then in the breakout panels, there will be opportunities for more interaction between the presenters and those in the audience. I think the issue that is raised by what we see going on in Darfur, the Congo, and what we've heard this morning is really bracketed by two questions that I'd hope you could address. One, how do you explain the paralysis of the international community, the inability to respond to situations we see going on today like Darfur or Congo? And related to that, the issue of political will, which seems to me to be at the heart of an effective response. How do you generate political will to respond to these situations?
Well, first of all, I think that there is the real question, and I tried to raise it in my remarks, as to what extent is preventing genocide and mass atrocities a national interest, not only for us, but also to try to figure out what role it plays in the developing national interests of other countries, because it is not just the United States. And you asked about the paralysis of the international community. It has a little bit to do with the fact that there is not enough political will in other countries and seeing it as a national interest. I think there is also a very basic issue, and I think it's very hard to deal with, and it's the issue of sovereignty. That is what we're seeing in Darfur, and there is a clash between the concept of national sovereignty and a new concept, which is the responsibility to protect. It is the duty, and I say this in classes that I teach, the first responsibility of the leader of a country is to protect the people, the territory, and the way of life. And if that leader is not doing that, then there is the new concept that it is the responsibility of the international community. But we are in the process of seeing that particular clash. I think also that Darfur is a perfect example of the tragedy of not paying attention to an issue early. That it has obviously gotten more and more complicated and harder to deal with, and attention has been diverted to other issues. And so I think it kind of proves the thesis of our task force report, which is it's important to get at it early. I know that if people in the audience were to ask a question, they would probably ask about how dare I talk about this since we were responsible for Rwanda. And I have often said that Rwanda weighs very heavy on my soul, but that I call it volcanic genocide. It came immediately after the shoot-down of the airplane of the Rwandan president, and it happened very quickly, and I think it would have been very hard to get forces there quickly, but we should have tried. Darfur, I have called rolling genocide, and therefore that watching the paralysis is very painful. I do think we now have to be looking at Congo and what is going there and learning some of the lessons and realizing that a lot of what is going on in Congo has to do with remnants of the Rwandan problem and refugee camps, which is why I think your points, Tony, about what was happening among the Kurds and moving people out of camps and not having those camps be areas where various aspects of the previous conflict can be rehashed and made more complicated. But I do think it's a combination of political will in our own country and in others. And in terms of political will in the United States, I do think that there is an opportunity, and our report talks about the importance of a structure, setting up what we call an atrocities task force, prevention that would really be looking at issues on a regular basis, and getting the American people to be more forceful in terms of the constituency on this, and a combination of a president who sees this as a national interest.
I would just add, and maybe in some ways repeating what I said, that in places like Darfur, what really frustrated me was watching the inability of regional and local organizations to deal with the problem. Ineffective peacekeeping or forces put on the ground, the inability of regional or sub-regional political organizations to come to grips and identify the problems. When we first in East Africa tried to build at least some military capability to deal with these problems, we were obviously focused on the tactical end and the equipping end. The African Crisis Response Initiative, a set of exercises that we called Natural Fury, but we had a missing piece. And the missing piece was, again, the integration of the political side of this and what would be the cooperation regionally in dealing with these problems. We introduced something that went beyond the military context, an effort called Golden Spear, that was an attempt to bring in at the ministerial levels, beyond just the military side, everybody together to discuss these kinds of things. What are the trigger points? What are the indicators? What is the best way to shed light on this? And I wouldn't minimize the CNN effect as become known. Oftentimes these problems become so chronic and enduring, we forget about them. We move on to the next story. And we lose that ability to keep a light shined on them, which does generate the kind of outrage that we should have in our own population internationally, but even locally to deal with these problems. And I really feel that it may not be enough, especially as the Secretary said it, when you're dealing with issues of sovereignty, to bring international pressure. Most of the times, local pressure, regional pressure is more effective. And most of the times, people that understand the cultural situation and have a greater affinity for the nature of that can be more effective on the ground. And I think a greater effort has to be made to try to shape local solutions to this and encourage the capacity and the ability to identify these early on, and the commitment early on by these sub-regional political groups to do something about it should it arise. That may have the greatest effect potentially, and kind of walking this cat back on Darfur might have made a difference in the East African context. Thank you.
Thank you. Schedule before we break, and I do want to make sure that our two presenters get their batons right afterwards. My special assistant, Heather Sensabaugh, will come up and just give you some guidance on how to get to your breakout panels. But let me just say that this may not look as powerful as a Marine Corps fighting knife, but they turn out to be multi-purpose instruments. Thanks so much to both of you for your presentations.
Thank you. And let me say I kept the knife on my desk throughout.